What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
There are moments in life that split everything into before and after, and for me that moment came sitting in my parents' kitchen, with my hands shaking as I explained to them what the doctors had told me. How I needed a procedure that wasn't optional or cosmetic or something that could wait, but something that meant survival, something that, if I didn't do it, could put me in the ground before my next birthday. And I remember thinking that of all the people in the world I could rely on, surely my own family would not hesitate to help me when it wasn't about comfort or luxury, but about whether I lived or died. I laid it all out, the cost, the urgency, the payment plan, the way I was willing to cover every dime I could, and all I needed was for them to co-sign, to lend me just enough to make sure I wasn't staring down the possibility of an early funeral. And I thought I saw some flicker of sympathy on my mom's face, but then my dad cleared his throat, and what came out of his mouth was so cold it might as well have been a stranger talking. He said it wasn't the right time, that money was tight, that it would set a bad precedent if they started handing out loans for every problem their kids came up with. As if me sitting there with my life on the line was the same as asking for cash to buy some new outfit or cover rent after being irresponsible. I remember sitting there stunned, because in my head I'd already been sure the answer would be yes, and all the begging I was preparing was just a formality, because what kind of parents look their child in the eye and basically say, "Good luck, you're on your own," when they know what's at stake? My mom jumped in, trying to soften it, saying things like, "Honey, we love you, but this is a big amount, and we just can't risk it right now. Maybe there's some other way," and I sat there nodding even though inside I felt like I was collapsing. Because what other way was there, and why did it even matter if it was risky, since the risk of doing nothing was that their daughter wouldn't be around anymore? The conversation ended in that vague, awkward silence that follows betrayal, and I left thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe they just needed time to think. Maybe tomorrow they would call and say they'd changed their minds, but that call never came. Instead, less than a week later, I got a text from my brother, grinning with his words, bragging that mom and dad had just surprised him with a brand new car, one of those shiny deals straight off the lot, complete with balloons at the dealership. Like some kind of celebration of how special he was. And that was when the knife twisted all the way, because I realized it wasn't about money being tight, it wasn't about bad timing, it wasn't about setting precedents, it was about me not being the priority. It was about them choosing comfort for their golden child over survival for me. He didn't need that car to live, he wanted it to look cool, to drive around and show off, and they didn't just help him, they funded it, they made it a big event, and suddenly all the excuses they had thrown at me were exposed as lies. I can't describe the kind of rage and numbness that hit me at the same time, because part of me wanted to scream at them, to storm back into that kitchen and lay out every hypocrisy they had just committed, but another part of me knew that if I said it, if I exploded, it would just get twisted back on me. I would be the ungrateful daughter, the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who always makes everything about herself. So I stayed quiet, I kept my distance, but inside something snapped permanently. That was the moment I stopped seeing them as my parents in the way people usually mean when they say that word, because parents protect you, parents step up. Parents don't sit there and weigh your life against a down payment on a car and decide the car wins. The first night after finding out, I lay awake thinking about every memory I had of them playing favorites, the way my brother always had the latest gadgets, the way his mistakes were always brushed off as boys being boys, the way my achievements were acknowledged with a pat on the back while his smallest efforts were turned into parades, and I realized that maybe this had been coming for years. Maybe this was just the final confirmation of something I'd been trying not to admit. That I was never going to be their priority, that no matter how much I tried to earn their approval, I would always be the second choice, the backup, the daughter who didn't matter as much as the son. And you know what? It hurt, but it also freed me, because once you see it that clearly, once you see that you could literally be dying and they would still choose him, you stop expecting anything else. When people ask me why I don't talk to my parents anymore, why I don't answer their calls or return their texts, I don't bother telling the whole story, because most people wouldn't believe it, and, honestly, it's too heavy to explain unless someone has lived through the same kind of betrayal. But if I could put it into one sentence, it would be this. They made me beg for my life, and then they turned around and bought my brother a brand new car, and if that doesn't tell you where I stand in their eyes, nothing will. And here's the part that might surprise you. I didn't crumble. I didn't just sit there and give up. I found another way. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't what my parents would have wanted or even approved of, but I managed to get what I needed. I managed to cover the procedure, and I walked out of that hospital with scars, sure, but also with a clarity that would shape everything that came after. That was the day I stopped being their desperate daughter and started becoming someone else entirely, someone they would regret underestimating. Because the truth is, I survived, and my survival was the one thing they hadn't counted on. And surviving gave me power. Power they would come to fear. The part people never see, because it is not dramatic in a way that makes good family stories at holidays, is the long stretch of days where you do the unglamorous math of survival. Where you speak to the insurance rep who recites policy lines like they were born with them tattooed inside their eyelids. Where you sit with a notepad figuring out what you can sell without wrecking your future. Where you call human resources and ask about leave and get transferred 3 times before someone kind finally explains how the paperwork works and which forms you need to hand in so your job is not gone when you come back, and where you learn that there is a charity fund at the hospital that nobody mentions unless you ask, and then ask again. Because assistance seems to exist only for people who refuse to accept the first no as final. I did all of that. I called, I sat on hold, I wrote down names and extension numbers, I handled documents that made me feel like a problem on someone's desk, and I reminded myself that this embarrassment was still cheaper than the price my parents tried to make me pay, which was silence and a future that ended too soon. I told a few friends the truth without prettying it up. I told my coworker Lila, who is loud in the best way, the kind of person who will ask a second question when everyone else drops their eyes, and she did something I was too proud to do first, which is that she set up a fundraiser page and wrote honestly that I needed help, and then she pressed publish and told me she did not want my thanks. She just wanted me alive, and when strangers started donating in amounts that were not big but looked huge to me because they were proof that people who did not even know me cared more than the people who raised me, I felt both mortified and grateful, and I sat with those two feelings because I knew they were the price of staying here. I sold a couple of things that meant something to me, but not as much as breathing did. I took on freelance work that left me exhausted. I accepted rides from coworkers without pretending it was convenient, and I listened to the hospital's case manager, a calm woman named Denise who moved like deadlines did not scare her when she told me exactly which department to lean on to get my application through the week it needed to be reviewed. While all this was happening, my brother kept popping up in the family group chat like a billboard for everything that had become obvious, posting an endless stream of photos of the car and stories about how smooth it felt to drive and how everyone turned their heads. And I texted back once, a message so measured it tasted bland even as I typed it, telling him I was happy he was happy and that I was currently choosing between skipping a necessary test or asking a stranger online to help me pay for it, and he responded with a thumbs-up reaction as if that closed the topic, and I looked at that tiny icon and thought, you just told me who you are more honestly than a paragraph ever could. My parents meanwhile sent me practical little notes asking how I was doing in that bright, chirpy way people use when they know they have something to feel guilty about and are working hard to pretend they do not. And I answered them with neutral updates that contained no invitation to continue the conversation, because I realized I did not owe them my pain narrated for their comfort. The surgery date came faster than my nerves were ready for, because when you are doing everything yourself, time slides by like someone greased it, and before I knew it I had my approvals lined up, my time off secured, and my bag packed with things that nobody else would think to bring because nobody else was thinking of me, and I walked into that building and did the thing, and I will not make a speech about it because it was not a moment I planned to remember as the peak of anything. It was simply the necessary task of getting my body back on the side of living. Afterward, I woke to the quiet that follows any big step, the quiet where you learn what next feels like, and there was a message from Lila telling me the fundraiser had hit its goal, plus a little extra, because a colleague's church group had shared it. And I felt something click into place deep down, a sense that whatever family was supposed to mean had been replaced by people who chose me without the bloodline excuse. Here is where my first small revenge started, and let me be honest about why it felt both petty and absolutely right, because sometimes the only way to balance a scale is with actions that look simple on the surface, but hit exactly where they should. I wrote an update on that fundraiser page thanking every person who had donated $1 or shared a link or sent a meal, and I made the list of gratitude long and specific, and then I added one sentence, just one, saying that it is a strange thing when a community of strangers steps in where family declined, and I attached a screenshot of the text thread where my parents told me it was not the right time to help, with their names cropped, but the tone unmistakable, and I pressed post without shaking. I did not call them. I did not warn them. I did not ask permission. I simply told the truth in a place where all the people who kept me alive could see exactly what they had done, and I thought, if they feel embarrassed, that feeling belongs to them, not to me. By the end of that day, my phone had lit up with messages from cousins I had not heard from in years, and from my aunt who never liked conflict until someone put it on her doorstep, and from 2 old neighbors who remembered me as the kid who always returned library books on time, and the common theme was shock followed by support, because even when people suspect favoritism, seeing it laid out in a refusal to help with a life or death situation snaps everything into focus, and the fallout did not land on me this time. It landed where it should have. That night I filed the paperwork to remove my parents as my emergency contacts and replace them with Lila and my friend Eric from work. I signed the hospital's form that restricts who can receive updates about me. And I sent a short email to my parents confirming the change, thanking them for their past efforts as if we were closing a contract, and clarifying that from now on they would not be contacted in any medical scenario because the trust required for that role had been broken by their own choice. And when my brother texted me a photo of the car parked in our parents' driveway with a caption about weekend drives, I responded with one sentence that tasted like truth rolling off a table edge, telling him that I was glad he found a vehicle that fits his sense of pride because I had just found something bigger, which was the ability to live without asking our parents for anything. And that from this point forward, any attempt to use my health as a conversation starter would be redirected to silence, and then I muted the thread, turned off my phone, and slept, not like someone who had won a war, but like someone who had finally chosen which battles mattered. I did not expect the calls that came the following week, not because I thought embarrassment would change my parents, but because I truly believed they would keep pretending nothing had happened, yet there they were. Voicemails stacking up with apologies that sounded like legal disclaimers, and requests to talk as a family, and anxious hints that my fundraiser post had caused confusion, and I listened to them once and then deleted them. Because the decision had already been made, and it was time to do the quieter part of revenge, the part most people do not applaud because it does not make good television, which is to maintain the boundary, to hold it when they knock on it, to let them feel the weight of a door that no longer swings on command. And as I finished the last form at work to finalize my medical leave and watch the approval email come through, I felt the smallest smile shape itself, the kind that comes from knowing that the thing you were told you could not do has been done, and that the people who could have made it easier chose not to, and that your answer will now be written in how well you live without them. They thought I would crawl back once the crisis passed. Instead, I started planning my exit so carefully they would not see me move until I was gone from the life they thought they controlled. And when they finally did turn around to chase me down, it would be too late. Because my next steps were already in motion and involved a kind of help they would never expect to need from me. When the procedure was behind me and I had proved to myself that I could survive without their help, I began to look at everything differently. Not in some dramatic lightning bolt way, but in a slow accumulation of thoughts that stacked up until the conclusion was unavoidable. And that conclusion was that if I stayed tethered to my parents the way I had been all my life, then every decision, every success, every failure would always be weighed against my brother and always be judged through the lens of their favoritism, and I realized I could not keep living in a house of mirrors where my reflection was distorted by their version of who I should be. I decided, quietly and without any announcement, to start stepping back, and it was not a dramatic fight or a slammed door. It was simply fewer calls returned, fewer visits made, fewer details shared. And the distance grew so naturally that they did not even notice at first, because people who are used to you carrying the weight of the relationship rarely notice when you start to put it down. I moved into a smaller apartment closer to work, a place they never visited because I never invited them, and I poured myself into my career with a level of focus I had not known I was capable of, because for the first time in my life, I did not have the constant noise of their judgment running in the background, and that silence allowed me to build something of my own without asking whether it would measure up to their impossible standards. I worked longer hours, I volunteered for projects that scared me, I built connections with people who saw me as competent and valuable without comparing me to anyone else, and slowly I began to see my own worth reflected back at me in promotions, in paychecks that grew, in opportunities that felt like doors opening instead of walls being reinforced. During this time, the texts from my parents shifted from casual check-ins to guilt-laden reminders, little lines like, "Your brother misses you," or "We haven't seen you in so long. Are you too busy for family now?" And each time I read them, I felt the pull of obligation, the one they had relied on for years, but I forced myself to sit with the discomfort instead of caving, because I knew that if I returned to the old dynamic even once, it would reset everything. And I had no intention of going back to being the child they could overlook until it was convenient to remember me. My brother, of course, kept up his smugness, sending photos of vacations, of dinners, of family gatherings I had not been invited to, always with a grin in his captions, always reminding me that he was the center of their world, and at first it stung. But then it became liberating, because the more I saw it, the more I realized that I was not missing anything worth keeping. The years that followed built me into someone they no longer recognized. I bought my own car with cash I had earned. I paid off the debts from my surgery completely. I took trips with friends that expanded my sense of what life could feel like when you were not tied down by constant disappointment, and I built a reputation in my field that made me proud in a way their half-hearted compliments never had. The irony was that my success, the very thing they had dismissed me as incapable of achieving, was what finally pulled them back toward me, but by the time they came looking, I was no longer the daughter waiting for their approval. I was a woman with her own foundation, and that difference shifted the power in ways they did not understand until it was too late. It started with small things, my mom calling to ask how I managed a certain insurance issue, my dad asking if I had any advice for a friend's daughter who wanted to get into my industry, little hints that they were beginning to see me as resourceful, as knowledgeable, as someone who could provide answers instead of always asking for them. I kept my responses short and polite, never cruel, but never opening doors, because I knew that this sudden recognition was not born of love but of utility, and I refused to confuse the two again. What really signaled the turning point, though, was the night my father called, his voice tight in a way I had rarely heard, and told me that my brother was struggling, debts, late payments, reckless choices, all the things they had excused for years catching up to him at once, and that they were worried, that they needed help, and that maybe I could lend a hand. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the man who had told me there was no money for my surgery now asking me to bail out the son he had chosen over me, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the hypocrisy was so thick it felt like suffocating in smoke. I let him talk, let him stumble through his justifications, let him try to frame it as family helping family, and I answered with the most non-committal words I could manage, telling him I would think about it, and the relief in his voice made me want to scream, because he thought he still had the power to assume I would rescue them. When I hung up, I realized something important. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for, the moment when the tables turned and they were the ones asking while I was the one holding the decision, and that shift was not an accident. It was the product of every step I had taken away from them. I did not tell anyone that night what I planned, because part of revenge is silence, the kind that lets the other side think they might still have hope. Instead, I wrote in my journal the words that became my guide. I will not give them what they denied me. I will let them feel what I felt. I will let them sit with the silence they created. That decision was not about cruelty. It was about balance, about letting the consequences of their choices finally return home. And while I slept that night, I dreamed not of arguments or confrontations, but of doors closing quietly, one after another, until the house they had built on favoritism and lies was left in darkness, and in that dream, I felt peace. When I woke, I knew exactly how to move forward, with calm, with precision, with the kind of measured coldness that does not shout but makes its point by simply refusing to bend. They thought they had finally pulled me back into orbit, but in truth, I had already charted a course that would take me far away, and the gravity they relied on no longer had any hold over me. And so I waited, knowing that the next time they asked, it would be bigger, and it would be desperate, and it would be my turn to choose whether to answer or to let them taste the silence they had once served me. The call that shifted everything did not come in the form of some dramatic family confession or a sudden outpouring of regret, but rather through a carefully worded voicemail from my mother in which she tried to sound calm and casual, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the panic she was trying to conceal. And what she said was that things had become complicated with my brother, that he was under pressure, that he had made some decisions that had not worked out, and that as a family we all needed to come together to help him through this difficult patch, as if the years of favoritism and blind indulgence had suddenly produced a result none of them could have predicted, when in truth anyone with clear eyes had seen this coming from miles away. I listened to her words more than once, not because I was considering doing what she asked, but because I wanted to absorb the irony in full, the way life had twisted the roles so completely that now the daughter who had been left to scrape and beg for her survival was being summoned as the potential savior of the son who had been handed everything on a silver platter. I called her back, not out of urgency, but because I wanted to hear the story directly, and she answered so quickly it was clear she had been sitting with the phone in her lap waiting for my number to appear. And she launched into the tale without even asking how I was doing, describing how the car payments had fallen behind, how my brother had borrowed money from friends and not paid it back, how he was now being threatened with repossession and lawsuits, and how his mental state was fragile, because he felt like everyone was against him. She peppered the story with phrases like, "You know how hard it is for young men these days, and family should rally around one another when times are tough," and I sat in silence, listening to the way she twisted everything into a narrative where my brother was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own mess, and when she finally paused to breathe, I asked the one question that had been sitting heavy in my chest. Where was all this rallying when I needed you? The silence on the other end was so sharp I could almost hear her thinking, and then she whispered something about how that was a different situation, how this was urgent, how we could not just let my brother fall apart. And that was when the bitterness that had been buried deep inside me rose to the surface, not in the form of shouting, but in the steady calm of someone who knows she holds the cards now. I told her I would think about it, and I made sure my tone was measured, because I wanted her to believe there was a chance I might step in, since that hope would be the first step of my plan, the plan that had been forming ever since they chose his car over my life. Over the next week the calls multiplied, my father leaving voicemails full of stern words about family duty, my mother sounding increasingly desperate, my brother texting me directly with half-hearted apologies laced with entitlement, insisting that I was overreacting to the past and that now was the time to prove we could stick together. Each message only confirmed what I already knew. They did not see me as a person with my own scars and history. They saw me as a resource, a tool, a backup plan when their golden boy's poor decisions had finally caught up to him. They spoke as though helping him was not optional, as though my refusal would brand me the villain, but what they could not grasp was that I had already lived through being painted as the villain, and I had survived it, and now I was not afraid of their labels anymore. I began to reply with calculated politeness, short texts that acknowledged their words without committing to anything, carefully written sentences that gave the impression of consideration, but in truth carried the weight of indifference. Because my silence in between those little responses was louder than any lecture I could give. I wanted them to feel the weight, the uncertainty, the same void I had lived in when I sat in their kitchen begging for help and left with nothing but hollow excuses. Every day they waited for my answer was a small slice of revenge, and I savored it, Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because I knew it was the only way for them to taste what they had once so easily served me. At work, while I thrived on new projects and earned respect for my ability to stay calm under pressure, I let their drama play out in the background of my life like a static-filled radio station I could turn down whenever I wanted. It was liberating to realize that their emergencies no longer dictated my schedule, that I could choose when and if to engage, and that my silence was a form of power they had never imagined I would possess. Friends who knew parts of the story asked me if I was tempted to cave, if I was tempted to swoop in and save my brother out of old habits, and I told them the truth. That temptation had died the day I saw him celebrating with his new car while I was calculating how to pay for survival. The day my brother finally called me directly, his voice full of a strained friendliness that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. I let him talk for several minutes about how he knew we had our differences, but how we were still siblings, and how he really needed me this time, and how it would mean the world to him if I could help him out of this jam. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I said one sentence that left him stunned. "It is funny how you only remember you have a sister when you are drowning." I let that hang in the air, let him stumble for words, and then I told him I would get back to him, knowing full well that I never intended to, because keeping him suspended in that uncertainty was the first taste of the justice I had been denied. And so the tables had turned, not through any confrontation or grand speech, but through the quiet reality that they needed me and I did not need them, that their calls came to me while my life moved forward without their involvement, that the balance of power had shifted so completely they did not even know how to approach me anymore. They had trained themselves to see me as the desperate one, the dependent one, and now that I was neither, they were left scrambling, and I was left holding the silence like a weapon they could not disarm. The truth I never spoke aloud to them, but carried like a steady flame inside me, was that every voicemail, every desperate text, every awkward attempt at reconciliation was not a burden, but a reminder that I had finally reached the point where my revenge could be carried out without lifting a finger, simply by refusing to give them what they had once so easily denied me. And while they waited, while they plotted, while they begged, I stayed quiet, preparing the final step, the one that would make it clear to them, once and for all, that the daughter they had dismissed had grown into the woman who now decided their fate. Because the beauty of tables turning is not in the noise of flipping them over, but in the silence of letting the other side realize, slowly and painfully, that they are no longer seated at the head. When I finally agreed to meet, I did it on my terms and in a place that did not hold any of the old power, and I told them straight that I was willing to talk about helping. But only if we were clear that help would no longer look like the quiet backroom handouts they were used to giving my brother, because I was not going to pour water into a leaking bucket and then pretend to be surprised when the floor stayed wet. So I laid out conditions that were not cruel or dramatic but practical and accountable, and I said that if a single dollar of my money or energy was going to move in his direction, then 3 things had to happen first. I said there had to be a written acknowledgement of the past, not for the theatrics, not to feed my ego, but because truth on paper has a way of stopping people from rewriting history later. And that acknowledgement would include what they chose when I was the one in trouble, and why I was now the one setting the rules. I said the car would be transferred into my name as collateral, because the thing they bought while I was begging for life had become a symbol of everything upside down in this family, and I was done letting that symbol sit on a pedestal. And I said my brother would enroll in a real financial counseling program with a nonprofit I recommended, with confirmation sent directly to me, because I was not going to be anyone's bailout while the bad habits kept their front row seats. You would have thought I asked for their house keys and firstborn child, because the way my mother's mouth fell open and my father started explaining how families do not put little contracts between them told me they had not come to make amends or take responsibility. They had come to reset the old dynamic where I prove I am a good daughter by rescuing the son who never has to rescue himself, and when my brother snorted and said I was being dramatic about ancient history, I realized the meeting had already given me what I needed, which was proof that they were not looking for help. They were looking for a return to the hierarchy where their comfort sits above my dignity. I picked up my bag, told them I would be available when they were ready to be honest, and walked out without raising my voice or slamming a door, and that calm exit was the first taste of the end, because they finally saw I meant what I said about choosing myself. The next week brought the inevitable escalation, late notices, a repossession warning, 2 angry texts from my brother calling me heartless followed by one pitiful call where he sounded like a child. And then a message from my father saying he would consider signing the title over, but only if I promised, on family honor, to give it right back after this storm had passed, and I wrote him exactly one line in response, saying that I do not trade in family honor that only runs one way, and that my terms were my terms, and that if they wanted rescue without accountability, they could call the same ghost they sent me to when they turned me down in their kitchen. 2 days later, with the clock ticking and the lender circling, my brother met me in a parking lot with the title and a bad attitude, and he signed because he had run out of time, not because he understood a single thing about why the pen felt so heavy. And I took the document without ceremony and told him that what happened next would be honest, which was more than he or our parents had offered me when I needed their help. I did not keep the car, because I did not need his toy or the headache, and I did not sell it to fix his mess, because I am not a human mop for spills I did not make, so I sold it cleanly through a dealer who wired me funds the same afternoon. And I moved that money exactly where it should have gone the first time my life was on the line, not into his tank and his insurance and his ego, but into a hospital microgrant that I set up with the case manager who had once helped me navigate the maze. With nothing but persistence and a stack of forms, and we named the fund with a title that would make me laugh years from now, not the right time, because those were the exact words my parents used when they refused me, and because I wanted that sentence to pay rent for the damage it had done. The fund is simple and boring in the way good tools often are. It pays for the gap that keeps working adults from scheduling procedures they need. It covers the piece that insurance will not, the ride that otherwise gets canceled, the child care that makes the appointment possible, and the case manager decides without me in the room because this is not a vanity project. It is a machine for making sure that when a daughter asks for help, somebody says yes. I wrote exactly one email to my parents and my brother after the sale cleared, and though my hands shook while I typed, my sentences were steady, because steadiness is what you owe yourself when you choose a clean ending over a messy fight. And I told them that the car was gone, that the debt would not be paid by me, that I would not be covering late fees or smoothing over the consequences of long patterns they still refused to face, and that the proceeds had been dedicated to a fund that makes sure people who are where I once was do not have to beg their families for permission to stay alive. I attached the letter from the hospital confirming the account and the name of the fund, and I did not gloat. I did not spike the ball. I did not demand apologies. I simply placed the receipts in their inbox the way they once placed excuses in my lap. And I ended with one quiet line. This is me rallying around family, the family I chose, the one that chooses me back. The fallout came exactly as predictable patterns predict, my mother crying that I had humiliated them, my father warning that I would regret making enemies of my own blood, my brother raging that I had stolen his property even though his signature says otherwise, and a cousin or two texting me to say they were proud, and a nurse from the hospital forwarding the first thank you note from a patient who had just been scheduled for a procedure they had been putting off for months because the copay was impossible on a fixed income, and I read that note twice, then 3 times, and I let it wash the last sticky residue of guilt off my hands. I updated my fundraiser page one final time, not with screenshots or recriminations, but with a simple announcement that the chapter had closed and the energy had been recycled into something that would keep people here. And I left the comments open not to stir drama, but because sunlight keeps stories honest. I keep ignoring their calls not out of spite, although there was a season where spite was the fuel that kept my legs moving, but out of loyalty to the woman I became when I realized I could live without their approval. And sometimes that loyalty feels like the only stable ground in a house where the floor used to tilt toward the golden child, and sometimes it feels like a quiet room where I can hear myself think, and sometimes it feels like justice that is finally proportional. Maybe one day they will understand. Maybe they will not. Maybe they will spin it forever as proof that I am cold, and that is fine, because the truth does not need their permission to be true, and the truth is this. They would not lend me money for a life-saving procedure, but they bought my brother a brand new car, and now the car is gone, and the money that once kept him coasting now carries strangers over the line where survival begins. And in that exchange, I found the ending I could live with. If you want to call it revenge, call it that, because it certainly felt like the last move in a game I did not choose to play. But if you ask me privately, over coffee, when nobody else is listening, I will tell you it was simply the first time I matched my decisions to my value without apologizing, and that is the part that feels epic, not because it is flashy, but because it is final, and because after all the noise and bargaining and guilt, the silence I chose belongs to me.